They say the grass isn't always greener on the other side. I wish I'd believed that before I made the biggest mistake of my life. Leaving my husband, Jacob, for another man wasn't just a choice. It was a gamble. One that left me haunted by what I'd lost and awestruck by the man Jacob became without me. Jacob and I had been married for 6 years. On paper, we had it all. A beautiful home, stable jobs, and a love that felt comfortable, easy. But comfort can be deceiving. Over time, I began to feel restless. The spark we'd once shared had dimmed, buried beneath the routines of everyday life. I told myself that this wasn't what love was supposed to feel like. Love was supposed to be passionate, thrilling, consuming. Or so I thought. Enter Ethan. He was everything Jacob wasn't. Spontaneous, exciting, and full of grand gestures that made me feel alive. We met at a work conference, and from the moment we started talking, I was drawn to him. He had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. It started with innocent conversations, but it quickly spiraled into something more. Ethan made me feel things I hadn't felt in years, and I convinced myself that he was the answer to the void I'd been feeling. I didn't leave Jacob right away. For months, I wrestled with guilt and doubt. I'd look at him and remember the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd held my hand through life's ups and downs. But then I'd think about Ethan and the fire he'd reignited in me. Eventually, the temptation became too strong to resist. One night, I sat Jacob down and told him the truth. "I'm not happy," I said, my voice trembling. "I feel like we've grown apart, and I've met someone who makes me feel alive again." The pain in Jacob's eyes was almost too much to bear. "Is there nothing left for us to fight for?" he asked, his voice breaking. I wanted to say yes, to tell him that we could fix things, but I'd already convinced myself that leaving was the only way to find happiness. The weeks that followed were a blur. I moved out, leaving behind the life we'd built together. Ethan and I started our new relationship, but it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. The passion that had felt so intoxicating began to fade, replaced by arguments and insecurities. Ethan wasn't the man I'd built him up to be in my mind. He was flawed, just like everyone else, and the fantasy I'd clung to started to crumble. Meanwhile, Jacob's life took a turn I never expected. At first, I thought he'd fall apart without me, but instead he did the opposite. He threw himself into his work, his hobbies, his friendships. He started going to the gym, transforming not just his body, but his confidence. I'd see photos of him on social media, smiling and thriving, and it stirred something in me. Jealousy, regret, admiration, a confusing mix of emotions I couldn't ignore. One day, I ran into a mutual friend who told me about a charity event Jacob was hosting. "He's doing really well," she said. "I don't think I've ever seen him this happy." Her words were a punch to the gut. I should have been happy for him, but all I could think about was how I'd walked away from the man he'd become. Ethan and I broke up a year after I left Jacob. By then, I'd realized that the happiness I'd been searching for wasn't something another person could give me. It was something I had to find within myself. But even as I worked on rebuilding my life, a part of me couldn't let go of Jacob. I missed him, his kindness, his steadiness, the way he'd always made me feel safe. I decided to reach out to him, not to rekindle what we'd lost, but to apologize. He deserved that much. When he agreed to meet, I was both relieved and terrified. Seeing him again was like a jolt to my system. He looked amazing, more confident and self-assured than I'd ever seen him. But it wasn't just his appearance that struck me. It was his energy. He seemed lighter, freer, like a man who'd found his purpose. "Jacob," I began, my voice heavy with emotion. "I'm so sorry for the way I hurt you. You didn't deserve that." He nodded, his expression calm but distant. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "But I've moved on, and I'm in a really good place now. I hope you find the same for yourself." His words were like a mirror reflecting back all the ways I'd failed him, failed us. But they were also a reminder of the strength he'd found, the life he'd rebuilt without me. It was bittersweet. knowing that the man I'd once loved had become someone I admired even more, but was no longer mine to hold. Jacob's story didn't end with me, and neither did mine. He found love again, with a woman who saw the man I'd taken for granted. They built a life together, one filled with the kind of joy and connection I'd always hoped for him. As for me, I learned to stand on my own, to find happiness not in the arms of another, but in the person I was becoming. Leaving Jacob was the hardest lesson I've ever learned. It taught me that love isn't always about fireworks and passion. Sometimes it's about the quiet moments, the steady presence, the foundation you build together. And while I can't change the past, I can carry those lessons with me, hoping that one day I'll find a love that feels just as real, just as enduring, as the one I left behind. But the story doesn't end there. One day, as I was browsing through a local bookstore, I stumbled upon a familiar face. Jacob was there, standing in the self-help section, flipping through a book. He hadn't noticed me, and for a moment, I debated whether to approach him. But something in me couldn't resist. "Jacob," I said softly, and he turned to look at me. His smile was warm but guarded, a reflection of the boundaries he'd built to protect himself. "Hi, Nora," he said, using the nickname only he had ever called me. "How have you been?" "Better," I admitted. "And you?" "Good," he replied, his tone genuine. "Really good." We stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Finally, I said, "I'm happy for you, Jacob. Truly. You deserve every bit of happiness you've found." He nodded, his eyes softening. "Thank you, Nora. That means a lot." As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Seeing Jacob thriving, knowing he'd found peace and love again, gave me a sense of peace as well. Our chapter together had ended, but it had shaped us both in ways that would stay with us forever. And as I walked out of the bookstore, I felt a newfound sense of hope. Hope that my own story was far from over, that the lessons I'd learned and the growth I'd experienced would lead me to something beautiful, because even in the aftermath of heartbreak, there's always the possibility of a new beginning.